Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Hey everyone, we have a super exciting episode for you today because as everyone in the waterfowl community knows, we have been eagerly anticipating the resumption of the full suite of waterfowl breeding population and habitat surveys, and we have that here in 2022. Last year, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did conduct some surveys in U.S. portions of the survey, but we lacked that full-scale complement of surveys. You couldn't get into Canada to conduct the surveys, but we're back at it this year. Pilots are in the air, observers are counting ducks, and we have on the phone here with us one of the actual pilots, one of the observers, we might say, that's actually doing the survey this year, retired U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service pilot biologist and good friend of mine, Fred Roetker. Freddie, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, good to be here.
Now, Freddie, at the outset there, I kind of struggled to describe whether you're a pilot right now or whether you're an observer right now. So why don't you just jump right into this? Tell us, you're retired Fish and Wildlife Service pilot biologist. We're going to talk about what that actually is here in a minute. But your role this year on the survey, are you pilot or are you pilot in the aircraft or are you observer? How's that working out this year?
I'm the observer. I'm sitting in the right seat. As a lot of folks know, there's only so much plexiglass in a small airplane. So the program over the years has been a pilot biologist in the left seat flying the airplane and an observer in the right seat. And I'm in that right seat role this year.
You're in the right seat role this year. We're going to talk about why that is here in a minute, but let's just back up a little bit and let's talk about a pilot biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Yes, that means that you are an aviator, I guess it would be the term. You fly planes. Tell us, for our listeners that don't know, what does a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service pilot biologist do in their role?
It is a unique job, and what the service looks for is somebody that has an aviation background and hopefully some float experience. They train for that. We're flying a Kodiak aircraft on amphib floats in the bush country up here. We're in northern Alberta right now. But anyway, there's a lot of pilots out there that are very qualified, and there's a lot of wildlife biologists that are super qualified. But they want that mixture, a pilot and also a wildlife biologist that has the interest in waterfowl. It's a whole lot more than aviation. You know, it's about, quote, being a duckhead, and that's the mixture they look for in a pilot biologist.
And so obviously you fly planes to help conduct these surveys. You actually, as a pilot, you are counting ducks along with the observer. Y'all have conducted, the pilot biologist role extends well beyond the waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey. And I'm going to catch up with you later on this year. We're going to have a couple of other discussions where we'll really get into the details of some of your history as a pilot biologist, some of your favorite stories and experiences. But pilot biologists for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are the linchpin for conducting these surveys that we know as the waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey, have been since 1955. We had a 2-year hiatus here recently. Unfortunately, we're back in the air. And I guess for context here on your credentials, how long did you work as a pilot biologist?
32 years, and I think 31 of those I made it to Canada on the breeding population survey.
Wow. Now, would that have been a record, or do you know?
No, I don't know. It's up there, but Art Brasden, the other legendary pilots before me, has certainly a lot of experience.
Okay, and so you and I overlapped, I guess, in terms of our work locations down in Lafayette, Louisiana. That's how you and I got to know one another, and you actually took me up in a plane a couple of, at least one time. I think right when I started, my stomach didn't really handle that too well. I've always said that's one.
I think we made a landing in the Wax Lake, in the Chaffalay River, on the way down to Chippewa Delta to give you a little break. But
That's
another incredible duck area.
Yeah. So I left an impression, maybe not a favorable one, but you certainly did. You landed and gave me some crackers. I believe Chad Corville was actually the other person that was with us. So very memorable experience, not necessarily in a good way, but anyway, yeah, you and I go back a number of years, and I thank you for taking time here to join us, Fred. You are, as we said, an observer. You're on contract this year. You're retired, but because of your 32 years of experience as a pilot biologist, 31 years there in Canada, participating in the survey, you bring with you tremendous institutional experience and history, and having someone like you kind of on contract for this for the survey this year is really important in situations where we find us right now, where there have been some recent retirements of pilot biologists, and we're having to train up new pilots, new observers. And so that's one of your principal roles this year, right? Talk about that a little bit in terms of, the new flyway biologist that you're working with. And I think he's a pilot biologist. Is that correct? Talk about what's going on there.
That is correct. He's one of the flyway biologists, the pilot biologist. It's Garrett Wilkerson. He's from Louisiana and no stranger to the duck world. Very avid duck hunter and very, very interested in especially the southeast region down there in Louisiana. He's living in Minneapolis right now. But that, a lot of in this role as pilot biologists, we spend our time on the breeding grounds in the summer and or in the spring, and banding in usually up here during August, and then a lot of the time in the winter is the midwinter surveys and historically down to Mexico. So Garrett is familiar with that habitat down there as well, and he's becoming familiar with it up here. But just a word about how these surveys are done. Probably some of the listeners thinking, how do these guys fly airplanes and count ducks at the same time? That's not so much on the wintering surveys, where it's more of a pilot role, although the observer picks up ducks on the left side of the airplane and an observer doing the heavy lifting of the counting. Up here is straight and level lines, and the next day we fly, will be all the way across the province. We're up against the Saskatchewan border now, and we'll go all the way across Alberta to the closest fuel stop is Fort Nelson, BC. But so long survey lines, and the pilot trims the aircraft where he's obviously making adjustments to get over hills and reduce altitude over a river system, but he's terrain flying, but he still has time to look out the window and count the ducks on his side, and it just works better than someone in the back seat. But that's how the survey works.
And we're going to move on here. I could ask you questions for an hour about these about the surveys and about your role as a pilot biologist. And I want to do that at some point, because you and I have talked for hours on previous occasions. And so there's a ton of super interesting information that I can get from you. And I'll do that at some other point. But let's get to what you're seeing right now, or what you have been seeing. I'm going to give a little timestamp here. Today, we're recording this on Tuesday, May 24th, and we have the opportunity to do this because y'all have benefited from, as you were telling me earlier, recent string of favorable weather. That's one of the things that you always have to navigate around, is weather conditions. Can't fly in unsafe and bad weather conditions. But then once you fly a certain number of hours, or whatever the stipulation is, you have mandatory rest days. And I think today is one of those rest days for you. Is that right? Do I have that?
That's exactly right. We're taking it. We've been at it for, I think, 7 or 8 days online, and I think the rule is that it's 2 out of any 14. You could theoretically fly 12 days in a row, but we're here on the Athabasca Delta right now. We're overnighting in Fort Chipewayan, Alberta, the oldest community in Alberta, and the Peace Athabasca Delta is one of the most incredible deltas on the continent, and we have a lot of transcribing to do. So we're taking the mandatory rest day. There's weather elsewhere, and but a big part of this is just keeping the data straight. But to get right to your question, we're seeing ducks, and we think our timing is pretty good, and we ask me some questions. We're real excited about what we're seeing.
All right, good deal. So I want to provide some kind of geographic context for our listeners. I've encouraged people to do this on other episodes where we have some kind of geographic concept that we're discussing. In this particular case, I encourage everyone that's listening to this, once you have a chance, go to Google Maps or your other favorite mapping software and search for Peace, P-E-A-C-E, Athabasca Delta. And that's going to take you to the location where Fred's generally talking about. I think you said Fort Chipewayan is the actual little village or city town where y'all are stationed right now with the airport. But that's the general portion of that northern Alberta landscape where you are. It's an incredibly important waterfowl area. So that's very useful kind of spatial context for people to get an idea of that kind of landscape where you are right now. So the other question I want to ask you to set this up is that there's a number of survey teams out there consisting of a pilot and an observer. Do you know how many there are, Fred?
7 or 8.
Yeah, seven or eight that are kind of scattered across doing these surveys, so they kind of partition up this massive survey landscape among pilot and observer crews.
Yeah, just a couple quick comments of what we call the traditional survey area. The Dakotas right up to the Arctic Ocean. So that we have, of those 8 crews, 2 or 3 of them are in the States. The rest are here in Canada and the Prairie provinces. At least one crew out east, and Garrett and I are, as we say, in northern Alberta now. This unit we're in is the Northern Alberta Northwest Territories unit. So before this is over, within a day or two, we'll be in the Northwest Territories, and that our last line is up on the Arctic coast, where the Mackenzie River dumps into the Arctic Ocean. The town up there is Tuktoyaktuk, and Inuvik is inland on the Mackenzie Delta. But we'll buy a lot of fuel in Inuvik, but our last line takes us right up to Tuk, and incredible place. I'll tell you more about that later. But it's a big survey area, but from the prairies to the Arctic Ocean.
And one thing for people that later on this year, once the report is released, if you go to there's a certain section in the report where it breaks down the breeding population and pond counts in the prairie regions. It breaks down counts by these survey regions, and you can go and you'll be able to find that northern Alberta, Northwest Territory region that Fred's talking about there. I can't remember if it's broken out separately. Some of these may be kind of lumped together, but anyway, you'd be able to find that, and that's the area that Fred and Garrett are actually surveying. Now, Fred, over your 31 years participating in the survey, have you stuck with the same survey regions, or have you kind of had an opportunity to move around, or at some point in your career did you survey multiple kind of areas?
Yeah, 3 major. I've spent my career in Canada, done some limited stuff in the Dakotas, and obviously living in Louisiana and ferrying to Canada, got to see up close and personal the Dakotas and in Minnesota traversing. But I started in southern Manitoba, and then northern Ontario was part of that a few years later. And then moved to the northern Saskatchewan, northern Manitoba boreal area. And about the last 8 years or so of my career, I was up here in the NWT.
And so is that the extent of the survey region that y'all are surveying this year? I mean, I don't want to make it sound like it's only the northern Alberta, Northwest Territory region. It's a huge area. But are there any other regions that y'all are counting this year?
We sort of kissed the eastern part of British Columbia. When people think of BC, they think of the mountains, but there are the plains where we're turning around. When we get back out to Fort Nelson, we'll turn around there and come back to the east. But the Alaska Highway is basically the western border of that problem, of the survey in BC. But so it's diverse, but it's northern. There's another crew in southern Alberta during the prairie and a bit of bush, or as we call it in the boreal, up to where we started. But we start in in northern Alberta, and our primary, 80% of it is in the Northwest Territories.
Yeah. All right. Well, so this is a good place for you to describe the habitat types that you're seeing, that y'all encounter in that region. I know there's a number of them. It's going to be, largely boreal forest, but you can probably describe it in a way that's easier for our listeners to envision.
Let me think of a key word. Let's just talk about beaver ponds. There's not a day goes by that we don't say, look at that string of beaver dams up that drainage, and that's one of the incredible. And another thing, over the years, working in the boreal, and we've used outfitters and camps. Is most of the folks, everything's aviation based because there isn't any roads. So over the years, the outfitters have been real helpful, and of course, we'll encounter fishermen while we're there, and somebody said, "What are you guys up to? There's nothing up. There's no ducks up here. It's just fish." I said, "Look, guys, when you ride back and forth in the airplane at altitude over 1,500 and above, but I said when you're out there fishing, you see, oh yeah, there's ducks in every bay, but it does when you're looking at the shorelines, the boreal lakes just have incredible nesting areas, grass margins and whatnot, where birds can get away from predators. But it's the beaver ponds, the all those grassy margins of the big lakes, the rivers, and then the deltas. This big delta we're on now, and then the McKenzie Delta up on Arctic Ocean. We could talk for a long time about the excitement of looking at ducks in boreal habitat.
I'm sure. Now, Fred, you mentioned something about the altitude of the surveys, and you mentioned something about the altitude at which a lot of people fly up there being kind of 1,500 feet whenever you're kind of going from location to location. Maybe it's higher than that, but for people that may not have heard an earlier conversation with, I forget, it might have been Ken Richkes when we were talking about, what's the altitude at which you're flying the survey and looking out the window and counting ducks?
The average is about 150 or between 100 and 1. It depends on how tall the trees are, but we like to be low enough to speciate clearly, but high enough that the ground don't move too fast as you traverse along. So it's typically about 150 feet and slowed down to about 90 knots.
150 feet. I want people to just think about that for a minute. I mean, you're flying one of these aircraft. That's incredible. I have utmost respect for the work that y'all have done over the years, Fred. And I wish we could put every single listener, every single waterfowl hunter in the right seat of one of these planes for just an hour. And then I am confident their appreciation for the work that you do and the difficulty of that work and the remarkable job that you do would fundamentally change. And so my kudos and just incredible respect to y'all for that. So let's see here. Let's talk about what everybody's wanting to know. The area that we just talked about where y'all are surveying, give us a description of what you're seeing and kind of, I guess, Fred, in a relative habitat standpoint, relative habitat condition standpoint. You don't have numbers that you can share at this time, but you've done this for a number of years. How would you compare this year's? What have been some of the highlights, either in terms of water conditions as well as ducks that you're seeing?
Two major points. First of all, it's a late spring, one of the later ones I've experienced. And we did delay our arrival up here based on that. You don't want to get up here and everything still be ice. Now, we are still seeing ice. The bigger lakes, like Lake Athabasca here where we're sitting, and then, of course, Great Slave and Great Bear up in the territories, they're going to still be frozen even at the end of this survey. But we think our timing is pretty good. The streams are thawed, the small lakes, the myriad of beaver ponds and all that is all wide open. And in terms of social groupings of ducks, we're seeing lots of flock drakes in the mallards, which is indicative that the hen is nesting and they're already done with their duties and are ganged up. And still a lot of pairs, but and there are some birds still staging, especially the canvasbacks and redheads and scaup the diving ducks are still somewhat in transit, but that'll go on for another couple of weeks. So you just have to pick a time that you think's best, work around the weather, and we feel that we're pretty much on for the timing this year.
Now, we heard last year that based on, I guess, sort of anecdotal observations, we obviously didn't have surveys up there last year, but anecdotal observations, reports suggested that last year habitat conditions in the boreal were excellent, good to excellent across much of that landscape. How would you characterize it if you had to go like poor, fair, average, excellent? How would you consider and acknowledging that habitat conditions in the boreal don't vary as widely from year to year as they do on the prairies? There is still some variation. How would you characterize it up there this year?
I'd say good. And it's such a vast area that you have pockets of excellent. And I don't know that we've seen any poor, but one of the key things is the abundance of water this year. And everybody wants more water on the prairies, but nest flooding in a really wet year can be an issue, especially for the divers. So just as a anecdotal fact is we're going to have to work around the Hay River Airport, one of the crucial fuel stops in this area. Airports, it's kind of laid out that you have to, the workarounds involve some ferry time. But Hay River, the village of Hay River, it was one of the worst floods they've ever had, and the airport has been closed for almost a month, and it's scheduled to reopen in about a week. But we may or may not be able to get fuel there this year. But that flood is huge. I mean, there's areas that are too wet. I think the ducks will figure it out, but if anything is too much water this particular year in certain parts of the area.
Fred, you mentioned the prairies, just kind of in passing there, and I know you're not surveying the prairies. I am curious, however, if during your travels up there, if you crossed over any of that prairie landscape. I'm particularly interested in southern Saskatchewan and southern Alberta. We know what to expect and what's going on in southern Manitoba. We know that North Dakota is in great shape. South Dakota's got good water. But southern Saskatchewan, southern Alberta is an area that a lot of people are really interested in. Some indications are that it's still pretty dry. Have you been able to set eyes on any of that landscape during your transit there?
Yes, we have. So I flew commercial up to Minneapolis and joined Garrett and got the airplane ready. And anyway, so we left Minneapolis for Regina, Saskatchewan. So traversing eastern North Dakota, as you suggest, is just incredibly wet. There's some impaction to the ponds there, after a dry year, and that's for another episode. But to the margins, but into Saskatchewan, mostly looking pretty good. And there are some areas, and all of this is always hard to talk about because it's local. But overall, it looks pretty darn good, really.
And then what about into southern Alberta? Did you happen to make it?
We didn't really get to see that part of the world. We spent a couple nights in Regina and working. There's a new program that the service has this year for data entry. And since we were early and we were getting more up-to-date reports about the ice conditions, we use that time to get all our supports, all our computers geared up, and me geared up as the least probably computer literate guy. But anyway, so after we left Regina, we went up into northern Saskatchewan and right into our survey area. We entered Alberta in the boreal forest.
Okay, so you would not have even made it into southwestern Saskatchewan or southern Alberta. Regina, for those that don't know, Regina, Saskatchewan is sort of the southeast of Saskatoon. or southeast of Saskatoon, and so some of the drought maps continue to indicate a little bit of dry condition in southwestern Saskatchewan. And then, interestingly, I was at a conference last week and heard a guy talking about some of his research, not duck-related research, but prairie wetland related research, and commenting about flying out of Calgary or Edmonton and looking out the window and noticing how all the wetlands would dry, and that it actually complicated some of his research plans because the wetlands were so dry. You can't really study wetland activities, wetland biogeochemistry necessarily when there's no water in the wetlands or whatever it was that he was studying. So some indication that there's still some dry conditions there in southern Alberta. So it'll be really interesting to see those data when they come out, or talk to someone who actually flew that area. But yeah, okay. So that was helpful. Anything else, Fred? The two main things that I wanted to do with this episode was, one, demonstrate definitively to folks that the survey is underway, have somebody on the podcast that is actually participating in the survey. So that box is checked. The other is I wanted to give people some idea of the work that you do, just a brief introduction to it, and then also the, sort of early view description of what y'all are seeing in that area. Anything else we want to cover here, Fred?
No, I think as we progress up into the territories, we'll continue to I think as we flow through there, the timing will be pretty good. It's always good to get all the way up on the we'll be above the tree, be beyond the Arctic Circle and above the tree line, and it's always exciting to see the birds and get into some eiders and a lot of scoters on those lines, and a lot of white-fronted geese. The white fronts are it's really interesting to see a pair here and a pair there. They're scattered out across that entire landscape, and we usually see a couple barren ground grizzlies up there. I can't remember ever doing those lines without seeing at least one or two of the grizzlies, lots of caribou. So it's an exciting survey to be on, and it's just good to be up here seeing the ducks again in the spring and breeding plumage.
Fred, assuming that y'all have good weather, or decent weather, assuming you don't have some extended delay as a result of weather, how much longer do you think y'all will be conducting the survey? When will your responsibilities there kind of come to an end?
Yeah, it kind of depends on the ice line up in those last few lines from Colville Lake north, from say 70 miles north of Yellowknife on up to the coast. That area in a really late spring we've had the delay in the past, but I'm going to say we should be finished up between the 10th and 15th of June.
Okay, so still 2-3 more weeks there, just to give people an idea of how long these surveys are going on for. Y'all started when, did you say? Was it a week or?
I think we left Minneapolis, I believe, 14th of May, and somewhere in that, it all runs together, quite honestly.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. So just over a week maybe of actual survey time since then. So, okay.
Yeah.
All right, Fred, this has been fantastic. I appreciate you joining us here on your day off. I know you've got some work to do there with transcription and so forth. And then once the survey is complete, then the work continues. Take all of those numbers, all of those observations, and the people back east with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and I guess at all different locations throughout the service, will start working on this, crunching the numbers and getting the data out, writing the reports. I just don't think people appreciate how much work and time goes into producing all these, collecting the data, analyzing the data, summarizing it, writing the reports, getting it out. It's a lot of stuff, and hats off to all of the men and women in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Canadian Wildlife Service, state, provincial agencies, and even some nonprofit organizations. I'm pretty sure Ducks Unlimited Canada has some folks that are helping out with some of the ground counts. I can't speak to any of the other agencies or so forth, but I know there's a lot of people that contribute to this, and man, that work does not go unappreciated. So thank you, Fred. Thank you. And on behalf of everyone here at Ducks Unlimited, thank you. Thanks to Garrett. Thanks for everyone involved in the survey.
Yeah, you're welcome. We enjoy being here, and it's good to be back after after retirement, and the crews are all the flyaway biologists are excited to be back in the groove after the hiatus. So everybody's talking about how wonderful it is to see those ducks in breeding plumage, and it's good.
That's awesome. That's great to hear. Thanks again, Fred. We'll catch up with you sometime later on.
So long.
A very special thanks to our guest on today's episode, retired U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service pilot biologist Fred Roetker. He joined us from all the way up in northern Alberta, where he's been participating in the waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey. We thank him for his time and all the work that he's doing on this survey. As always, we thank our producer, Chris Isaac, who does an absolutely terrific job of these episodes and getting them out to you. And to you, the listener, we thank you for your time, we thank you for joining us, and we thank you for supporting wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.